after running a fraudulent cryptocurrency empire that swindled customers out of more than $8 billion. Former FTX CEO Sam Bankman-Fried was convicted by jurors of every single charge levied against him by the prosecution. It's no surprise to me that Sam was convicted. He's done some pretty awful things over the past couple years. And as important as it is to hold people accountable, I also think that a prison sentence of 110 years for a non-violent offense is absolutely ridiculous. And in today's video, I'm going to tell you why. Hello everyone and welcome back. I am the Part-Time Economist, and in today's video I wanted to use the recent trial of Sam Bankman-Fried to bring up a broader point of discussion. Specifically the fact that the criminal justice system in the United States of America is much more harsh, much more strict, imprisons more people than any other country on the planet, and does things to its citizens that are considered violations of human dignity in many other developed countries. Now, before we start this video, I want to be very clear. This isn't a video trashing America, saying America is bad. It's also not a video saying that your friend Bob, who works for the local PD, is a bad person. This video is from an academic standpoint, and I really want to make the argument that the policy of mass incarceration in the United States simply isn't working. It's not working from an effectiveness standpoint, and it's not working from a moral or human rights perspective either. At the end of the video, I'll share some of my thoughts as to how we can improve. So let's start off with the arguments. The first thing that I want to point out is that the United States, as a country, the land of the free, as we like to call it, imprisons more people than any other country on the planet. More than the so-called totalitarian regimes, the evil empire, the places that are run by dictators, right? We imprison in the United States more people than China, Iran, all of these places that they tell you not to visit. Also, if you adjust this to account for the rate of incarceration, because obviously the U.S. is a large country, so when you normalize by the rates of incarceration, the U.S. is still pretty much at the top, especially among developed Western nations. So we like throwing people in jail in the United States, and the argument that many people will make is they'll say, look, that's the price of a civilized society. You don't want these killers on the loose, do you? And if putting more people in jail made us safer, that might be a legitimate discussion. But the data simply doesn't support that hypothesis. If we look at the rates of intentional homicide, this is where someone kills someone else, they know they're killing someone, and they are wanting to do it. The United States is far less safe than many places that we consider, quote, third world. You have a higher chance of being murdered in the United States than you do a place like Zimbabwe, Kenya, Cuba, Pakistan, Rwanda, Iran, or many of these other places that they tell you not to go because they're too dangerous. So what we're doing clearly isn't working. If you're in the United States, you have a greater chance of being imprisoned, and you also have a greater chance of getting murdered. So it's not a trade-off scenario. It simply isn't working. And I want to point out, this isn't just some random speculation that I've come up with for the purposes of complaining. The National Institute of Justice, an official organization, is literally telling us the same thing if we would only listen. Specifically, increasing the severity of punishment does little to deter crime. The argument that I would make is that we are wasting money, putting people in jail, paying these expenses 30, 40, 50, 60, however many years, when instead what the National Institute of Justice is telling us is that apprehension, the probability that someone will be caught, is more of a deterrent than knowing that their sentence is going to be 30 years instead of 20 years. So all of this money that we're wasting, let's instead turn that to prevention, to apprehension, things that truly do decrease the risk of crime being committed. I know it sounds good to say that we're tough on crime, but there's a difference between having excessive punishment of someone that's already committed a crime and preventing crime in the first place, which should be the goal of our justice system. So let's set aside the effectiveness argument for a moment. If we think back to the founding of the United States, we really prided ourselves on being a trailblazer in Enlightenment thought. The prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment by the Eighth Amendment was a real trailblazer for human rights back in its day. At that time, we were really setting a trend of a more just, a more fair society. Now, obviously, there was a lot wrong with the Constitution. There were a lot of groups that simply didn't have rights, but I'm specifically talking about the Eighth Amendment. Saying that cruel and unusual punishment was not allowed was a major step forward. But unfortunately, we are falling behind many other developed countries. If we look at something such as life imprisonment or the death penalty, we can see that the United States is virtually the only country in the developed world that still maintains the death penalty. If you look at all of these countries in red where the death penalty is still allowed, those are the countries that you see politicians criticizing on TV for their human rights abuses, for saying that we don't want to be like them. And at the end of the day, when it comes to criminal justice, we are very much just like them. And it's not just the death penalty. The United States imprisons more people for life sentences than any other country. You may find it interesting to know that in 2008, the United States was the only country in the world that had a minor, someone under the legal age, serving a life sentence for crimes that were committed when they were a minor. If that doesn't tell you that the U.S. is out of whack with the rest of the world, then we need to look at the data, because many other countries, Canada, has ruled that life without the possibility of parole is unconstitutional. Germany has said that confining someone with no possibility of release is a violation of human dignity. Even many countries in South America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Colombia, Uruguay, Bolivia, Ecuador, have abolished life in prison. Now, the thing I want you to understand is that the courts have upheld that life imprisonment and the death penalty are not inconsistent with the Eighth Amendment. So I want to understand that all of these things are still allowed in the U.S. The issue that I'm making is, should they be allowed? Do we as a country want to align ourselves with our developed country neighbors that are more progressive, or the countries that we criticize for human rights abuses? And I specifically want to drive home the point of how closely related the death penalty and life in prison are. Because as Pope Francis has said, life imprisonment is essentially a hidden death sentence. We can see that people who are sentenced to prison on average lose about 2 years of life expectancy for every year that they spend in jail. And I don't want to go into all of the horrors of jails and prisons in the United States, but it's sufficient to say that this is not the Andy Griffith Show being imprisoned in Mayberry. In many cases, prisoners are subject to inhumane conditions. They may not have access to their medication, and there's a real risk that you could literally be eaten alive by bugs. So the key argument that I'm making here is that prisons in the United States are especially punitive compared to those in many other developed countries. It shortens a prisoner's lifespan, and especially if we're talking about a life sentence, it, by all accounts, is a death sentence. So what do we do about it? How do we move forward? Because I remember someone once told me that if you bring up a problem without a solution, you're just complaining. And I certainly don't want to be a complainer. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not a policy expert in this matter, but I do think a good starting point is the Mandela rules that have been articulated by the United Nations. Specifically, we can see that the goal of confinement, of imprisonment, is to help reform someone, to help them learn what they did wrong, to get them the skills and training of what they can do better, and then eventually release them into society. Now, does this look like a 5-year prison sentence, a 10-year, 20, 30? What does that specific number look like? I don't know. I think it depends on the crime. I think it depends on the circumstances. But as a overarching goal, I think we should put the focus on helping people to improve, helping people to learn what they did wrong, helping people to learn what they did better. And that's not to say if someone is clearly violent, if they're not following the rules, if they're a threat while in prison, it's not saying that at the end of their sentence, 5-year sentence, okay, you've done nothing wrong. Many other countries, when they're considering parole, they evaluate a prisoner's conduct, how they're doing, right? So my argument isn't just, hey, if someone did something bad, they just get a short vacation stay and they're back on the streets, right? It's a process. But I think our overarching goal needs to be refocused. A focus on helping people to change, helping people to develop, helping people to not make the mistakes again. And for people that say that this is going to increase the crime rate, again, we have to look at the data. If we look at countries where there is more of a focus on rehabilitation, we see that the rate of reoffenders is considerably lower than in the United States. So the good news is that if we were to do this right, if we were to follow the best practices, we could have the best of both worlds. A system that is more humane, more fair, more equitable, gives people a chance to change, while also having a system that protects us as a society, that makes us safer. Obviously, everything I have said here is completely my opinion. I'm always open to new ideas, open to change, so feel free to leave your comments down below. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.